So I recently watched a TED Talk by Jamie Wheal of the Flow Genome Project. The TED Talk was called From Altered States to Altered Traits, Hacking the Flow State. Now you guys watch Shots of Awe, you know that I'm very passionate about this idea of the flow state, this state of virtuosity and enhanced performance among artists and musicians and writers and elite athletes. They go into this zone where they experience this transient hypofrontality, this temporary moment where the ego dissolves, you get sort of hyper-focused in what you're doing, you drop into theta states like meditating monks, and you're able to achieve excellence and virtuosity that exceeds normal human levels and thresholds for what's possible. We transcend ourselves in these moments of flow. And Jamie Wheal, who co-founded the Flow Genome Project with Stephen Kotler, talks about it in this TED Talk, where he says a lot of us know these flow states, but our self systems are like these colanders. We're like this colander full of holes. And no matter how much flow we pour into it, we're always bleeding from this, this bucket full of holes. And so we achieve these temporary flow states, but then Monday, we're back to where we were. As he says, it's easier than ever to get high. It's as hard as it's always been to stay that way. But then the idea of hacking flow means, what if we could transform this colander into a chalice? What if we could render ourselves whole? Or as Jamie says, render ourselves holy? What becomes possible with just one drop beyond that flow? What becomes possible with the rest? I mean, it's a wonderful idea. Most of us, Jamie says, are still stuck as like bliss junkies. We get stuck on the state without raising the stage. But now, insights into the neurophysiology of the brain, the neurochemistry of the brain, we can actually hack flow. We can hack nirvana. We can experience design and induce and design our cities and our social systems with positive self-reinforcing feedback loops that teach flow, to make flow an innate, natural emergence. This is what becomes possible. And then, who knows, right? As Stephen Kotler says in the book, The Rise of Superman, who knows what becomes possible? We become superhumans.
You've all experienced a flow state. You may have called it something else. You may have not had a name for it. Abraham Maslow called them peak experiences. Jim Fixx, back in the 70s, called it a runner's high. Phil Jackson, the Lakers and Bulls coach, calls it being in the zone. Miles Davis, John Coltrane called it being in the pocket, right? But regardless of what we call it, the experience is the same. Time slows down or speeds up, right? A 3-hour conversation with a dear old friend, or an amazing first date that goes by in what feels like 15 minutes. 5 seconds barreled in a wave that feels like 5 minutes. Myself disappears. Action and awareness merge. The beer and the doer become the same thing. And even if we just glimpse it, we spend the rest of our lives looking for it again. Now, up until really recently, that was as far as it got. That was all we could do. We have these strikes of lightning, yee-haw, amen, and then we just had to twiddle our thumbs and just try spinning the combination lock to see if we could ever get back. But in the last 5 years, some amazing things have happened.
Flow is what we see a lot of people enter into when we see musicians, artists, swimmers, runners, right? People who are just completely immersed in the moment where they experience states of flow. And I'll explain what I mean by them. Now, I want you to think about when you feel you have experienced flow. That's the best way of understanding it. It's much harder to articulate. But whenever you felt that you're completely immersed, completely absorbed, you almost feel like something's working through you. You feel highly connected. And then you feel that time just went so fast, even though you were immersed for so long, and that there were rapid moments of attention and intention all intertwined together. And when you walk out, you think, wow, that was productive. Wow, that was effective. Wow, I didn't even feel hungry. Wow, I didn't even feel tired. Wow, I actually didn't feel any of those things, yet we achieved so much. The reason why I'm so excited about flow state and you reaching your flow state is because it allows us to start feeling confident, appreciating ourselves and appreciating others, and feeling new levels of excitement, new levels of joy through very simple things. You can be doing the same thing again and again and again, but still feel motivated by it because it puts you into flow, right? Because it puts you into flow. Now, another way of getting into flow is finding an internal dialogue or music to go with what you're doing. So I spoke about the music aspect, but it's also a dialogue. And one of you asked earlier, what is the way of making flow last? So we've talked about moments of flow. When you get in the zone while you're running, when you're singing, when you're playing an instrument, when you're walking in nature. How do you make that last? Flow is ultimately underpinned by guiding principles, by a massive transformational purpose, by meaning and purpose, by having underlying principles that we live by, that allow us to tap into flow daily. Now, I was speaking to someone the other day. They were saying to me that they find traveling quite hard. They like being rooted to a place. And they were saying that I'm very different from them. They're saying, Jay, you're very different from me because you don't mind traveling. And actually I said, well, you are rooted to places. I'm rooted to purpose. So I like being rooted too. It's just that I like being rooted to purpose, which is not defined by geography, but you like being rooted by place, which is defined by geography. But rooting is very natural for all of us. All of us are rooted to something. And when we change that something to purpose and meaning, that allows us to live much more flexible, abundant, powerful, empowered lives, because that purpose is not bound by people, place, project, people's attitudes, the hypnosis of social conversation, as Deepak was talking about yesterday, right? Your purpose and meaning, when it's not bounded by the hypnosis of social norms, by places, projects, people's opinions, by people's attitudes, that's when you can access flow all the time. So we're all rooted. We're either rooted to having a group of people that make us feel more confident or a thing, but we have to look for confidence, love, passion, purpose, in our purpose, in finding meaning. So what I really recommend to you to do is, I started off this dialogue by asking you what motivates you. That's really what it's about. What really motivates you? Why do you do what you do? We had Simon Sinek on the show about a month ago, maybe a bit before that. And we're talking about why, the power of finding why you do something. So what motivates you? Why are you doing anything you're doing? All those answers you gave at the start. Start finding your love, your meaning, your confidence in that purpose. Be rooted by that purpose. And then you can access that all throughout the day. Wherever you are in the world, you can access that. You can grow from that.
The Flow Genome Project, what we've discovered, when people want more flow in their lives, the number one thing we can tell them is that there is a flow cycle. So the old idea about flow was that it was a binary. It was like a light switch. You were either in the zone or you were out of the zone. What we now know is that flow is a 4-part cycle. And you have to move through all 4 parts of the cycle before you can return to the flow state itself. The neurobiology of the flow cycle and the actual research came out of Herb Benson's work at Harvard. He kind of laid the foundation for it. But what we've discovered is at the front end of the flow state, there's a struggle phase. This is a loading phase. You are loading, then overloading the brain with information. For a baseball player, this is learning to swing a bat at a ball. For a writer planning a new book, this is when you're doing interviews. This is when you're reading. It's when you're diagramming structure and things like that. It's very unpleasant as a general rule. So even though flow may be the most desirable and pleasant state on earth, the actual flow cycle itself starts with a very unpleasant state known as struggle. From struggle, you move into release. This literally means you want to take your mind off the problem. So what happens in flow is we are trading conscious processing, which is slow, has very limited RAM, right? The working memory can only hold about 4 items at once, and it's very energy inefficient. For subconscious processing, which is extremely fast, it's very energy efficient, and has pretty much endless RAM. So to do that, you have to move from struggle, you have to stop thinking about what you were trying to think about, basically. You take your mind off the problem, you go for long walks. Gardening works very well. Building models works very, very well. Albert Einstein famously used to row a boat into the middle of Lake Geneva and stare at the clouds, right? Once you can take your mind off the problem, and then, by the way, one of the only things that you can't do to move through release is watch television. It actually changes your brainwaves in a way that will block flow. But once you move from release, there's actually underneath the surface neurobiologically, there's a global release of nitric oxide, which is a gaseous signaling molecule. It's found everywhere in the body. This flushes all the stress hormones out of your system and replaces them with kind of feel-good performance-enhancing neurochemicals like dopamine and anandamide and serotonin and endorphins, which underpin the flow state as well. You're in the flow state. itself. This is the third stage in the struggle. And on the back end of the flow state, there is actually a recovery phase. And this is really, really, really critical. So you go from this amazing high of flow to a very deep low that shows up in recovery. A lot of this is that all those feel-good neurochemicals have drained out of your system. It takes certain vitamins and minerals and sunlight and things like that to rebuild them. So the recovery phase on the back end of the flow state is actually very, very unpleasant as well. And if you really want to hack flow, you need to learn how to struggle better, and you need to learn how to recover better. And one of the most important things in recovery is you need some emotional fortitude, some grit. You have to basically hold on to your emotions, not get stressed out at the fact that you no longer feel like Superman. And the main reason, two reasons for this is, one, if you get too stressed out at feeling low, you're going to start producing cortisol. A little bit is fine. Too much of it blocks the accelerated learning that comes with flow. So you'll get the short-term benefit of the flow state itself, but you won't get the long-term benefit, the accelerated learning that you get in flow. The other problem is if you have to move from recovery back into struggle and you're bummed out at no longer being in flow during the recovery phase, it's very hard to get up for the difficult fight of struggle that follows.
Flow, also known as terms such as being in the zone or being in the groove. The flow state was originally identified and named by one of the founding figures of positive psychology, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. In 1996, Csikszentmihalyi did an interview for Wired magazine and described flow as being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away. Time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. Your whole being is involved, and you're using your skills to the utmost. It's the state that the kayaker finds himself in when he's hurtling along the treacherous white waters. The state the pianist finds herself in when she's now deep into the groove of a jazz improvisation and the music just seems to be flowing out of her fingertips. And perhaps you can think of times in your own life when you've been in this state too. Even if you're not into extreme sports, music, art, or similar types of creative endeavors, perhaps you can think of a time where you were so immersed in the task at hand that your sense of self seemed to disappear, your awareness and actions merged into one, and on reflection, you realize time seemed to pass in a curiously strange way. Maybe you looked back on how much you'd done and created and saw something akin to the whopping 500% productivity increase that flow researchers see in their subjects. But maybe you hit this state by accident, not quite realizing exactly how you got there. So what exactly is it that brings on these states? How can we be more intentional about accessing deep states of flow? Csikszentmihalyi recognized and named the concept of flow and built a model of it to help us understand how to get deeply into it. And he posits that unless we turn them into a kind of dance or play, activities that present little challenge and demand little of our abilities can often lead to a sense of apathy. If an activity's challenge level is too high and we lack the abilities to take it on, there's this temptation to get overwhelmed and anxious. If we have all the abilities to do the activity and it's just not that much of a challenge, it's easy to be relaxed and contented, but it won't be enough of a challenge to kick us into that hyper-focused flow state. However, if the activity presents a hefty challenge and we have the ability to rise to the occasion and take it on, our brain starts releasing those large doses of neurotransmitters linked with all the pleasurable emotions and the heightened state of consciousness one experiences in deep flow. Think of it like this. A whitewater kayaker is hurtling down the river rapids. He's practiced for hours in less volatile situations, working his way up through progressively more challenging courses and honing his skills along the way. He now has the ability to face these treacherous white waters with a sense of confidence, but with all the tricky twists and turns and hazardous drops, there's still a high level of risk and challenge demanding his unwavering focus and alert awareness. As he drives his attention deeply into his body and the environment, sensing the nuances of each moment, he soon enters a deeply immersive, heightened state of consciousness where time passes in a peculiar way. The mind-made self disappears and he seems to become one with the kayak and the flowing water. But we don't all need to be whitewater kayakers to find deep states of flow. Each of us have interests in particular areas: dance, music, technology, business, or science. Every endeavour has activities that will present a hefty challenge and demand our sharpened abilities. It's just a case of getting deep enough into them and immersing ourselves into the intricacies of our interests with a sense of curiosity and persistence. Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheal founded the Flow Genome Project on a mission to unlock the next level of human potential and conduct further research into the secrets of flow psychology. And they identified 4 distinct phases of deep flow. The first phase they call the struggle. It's the period of time that you first start to face the task at hand, and it's challenging. There's lots of information going on. You're very aware of how much you're having to exercise conscious effort, and it might even feel a little bit uncomfortable, just like how I described how it often does for me when I first start planning a video. Then there's the second release phase. You let go of so much conscious effort. Perhaps you take your mind off the task for a bit, going for a walk or taking a moment to relax. Then the third phase hits and you emerge into deep flow. You're no longer concerned with time or self. You feel alert, alive, engaged, and inspired. Your best ideas just seem to pop up out of nowhere and you're performing effortlessly with excellence. Then, after a period of time, you wind down and enter the recovery phase. Some people try and skip this phase and keep chasing that flow high, but we all need to know that the body and mind needs rest. The recovery phase is where memory consolidation and brain changes associated with learning take place, and meditation, relaxation, or sleep are essential components to complete the cycle. So just remember, it's easy to get discouraged and think that these states are impossible to achieve for you when you're struggling with a challenge. But it's actually the acceptance of that struggle that initiates deep flow. With a bit of persistence, what can first appear to be an insurmountable challenge can soon turn into a time where you might even surprise yourself with your ability to become completely absorbed and create or perform with speed and excellence, leaving a huge smile on their face. But seeing as there's said to be 4 phases of flow, where we're presented with an activity and at some point we reach the other side, does that mean that these states are just temporary and fleeting? Are we bound to only hit flow on the odd occasion and spend the rest of our lives comparatively apathetic in a slew of drudgery? Sure, we would be kidding ourselves if we think we can perpetually be in a state of high energy or rapid productivity. We can all sense that life moves in seasons, with periods of rest and relaxation, contemplation, or simply just being. And not all of us have jobs or lifestyles conducive to states of highly energized flow right now. But the good news is we can be in a kind of flow much of the time when we bring a sense of playfulness and acceptance to our lives. Csikszentmihalyi described this as having an autotelic personality, one in which a person performs acts because they are intrinsically rewarding, rather than to simply achieve goals or do things to add to this mind-made sense of self. One way to achieve this is to approach even the most seemingly mundane situations with an attitude of humility and a depth of presence. and turn things that others might find boring into a kind of play or game. When we look at our lives as a series of irritating problems, huffing and puffing at every next thing that we have to do, we can easily build up a state of inner resistance, sucking all the enjoyment out of life and eventually living in a state of chronic stress or apathy. But when we, as best as possible, we approach things with a sense of curiosity and joviality, we start to flow with life, even when it's not the most exhilarating. And we start to bring more joy to every activity. And when we sustain this state, it starts to affect the people around us, bringing more happiness into their lives and making them want us in their lives more often. Perhaps they even introduce us to a new group of friends. Perhaps the fun and curiosity we inject into a series of events leads us to a new job opportunity or even our next life partner. Through the course of our lives, we can never tell exactly what situations we'll find ourselves in, but when we flow with life, whether we take up extreme sports, immerse ourselves in our creative endeavours, or simply turn up to our daily activities with a sense of play, we can bet that in general, we'll find ourselves in more enjoyable or inspiring situations, so we can create more of what we want in our lives and have a positive impact on the world.